Well, this guy was so innovative and such a genius. He said the quote, "Other people race against competitors. I race against forces of nature and gravity."
9 violations. That was the number NASCAR handed Henry Smokey Yunick during a Daytona 500 inspection, right before he fired up his stripped-down Chevelle and drove off without a fuel tank still sitting on the ground. For nearly 3 decades, Yunick treated the NASCAR rulebook less like a law and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved, and the sport spent just as long rewriting that book, trying to catch up with him. From a scaled-down race car to a fuel line long enough to wrap around a doghouse, his garage produced tricks people still argue about in pit lanes today. Stick around, because these are the 13 moves that made number 13 inside the best damn garage in town. Before any of the tricks, there was the man himself, and understanding him is the only way to understand why NASCAR feared him so much. Henry Yunick was born in 1923 and grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania, where he learned to fix anything with an engine long before he ever saw a racetrack. He picked up his nickname during a motorcycle race in his teens, when a competitor could not remember his real name and simply called him Smokey after the cloud pouring off his bike. He flew more than 50 combat missions as a bomber pilot in World War II, then settled in Daytona Beach and opened a small repair shop that grew into a legend known across the sport as the best damn garage in town. From that shop came engines, race cars, and drivers who would go on to become NASCAR royalty, and Yunick himself became twice named NASCAR Mechanic of the Year, while guiding teams to 57 Cup Series wins and 2 championships across a career that stretched from the 1950s well into the 1970s. He wore a trademark white uniform, a battered cowboy hat, and usually had a cigar or corncob pipe within reach, a look that made him instantly recognizable in pit lanes from Daytona to Indianapolis. He was not just clever, he was relentless, and that combination is exactly what set the stage for everything that came next. With the man established, it is time to get into the actual tricks that built his reputation, starting with the one most people picture first when his name comes up. Number 12, the 7x8 scale Chevelle that broke NASCAR's brain. Few cars in NASCAR history have generated as much folklore as Yunick's 1966 and 1967 Chevrolet Chevelles. A detailed breakdown of his most inventive builds explains that Yunick reportedly moved the entire body of the car backward roughly 3 inches, raised the floor pan, smoothed the underside for better airflow, and made the bumpers and fenders sit flush against the body. The popular legend claims the whole car was built to 7/8 scale, and while that specific ratio has been disputed over the years, the changes were significant enough that rival drivers were convinced something illegal was happening the moment they saw it on track. The car passed inspection anyway, took pole position at the 1967 Daytona 500 with Curtis Turner behind the wheel, and forced NASCAR to eventually introduce body templates so officials could measure every car against its original factory profile. That single car did more to reshape technical inspection than almost anything else in the sport's early history. Once NASCAR started measuring bodies more closely, Yunick simply moved his creativity somewhere officials were not yet looking, which brings us to one of his most quoted stunts. Number 11. The 11-foot fuel line nobody saw coming. NASCAR had rules about fuel tank size, and Yunick followed them to the letter, at least on paper. What the rulebook never mentioned was the size of the fuel line running from that tank to the carburetor. A feature retelling his most infamous fuel tricks explains that Yunick coiled roughly 11 feet of 2-inch diameter tubing underneath one of his cars, effectively adding several extra gallons of gasoline that never had to pass through the tank itself and never showed up when officials measured tank capacity alone. It looked absurd sitting under the chassis, closer to plumbing than a fuel line, yet nothing in the rules said a line could not be that long or that wide. The extra fuel meant fewer pit stops, which meant real time gained on the track, until NASCAR finally closed the loophole by regulating fuel line dimensions along with tank capacity. That fuel line trick fed directly into arguably the most famous Smokey Yunick story of all, the one about the car that supposedly drove away without any tank at all. Number 10. Driving off without a fuel tank at Daytona. The story goes that during Daytona 500 inspection, officials pulled the fuel tank out of Yunick's Chevelle entirely to check its true capacity, then handed him a list of violations to fix before he could race. Accounts differ on the exact number, with some versions citing 9 violations and others closer to 16, but the ending never changes. Yunick reportedly climbed into the car, fired up the engine, and drove it back to his shop down the road, leaving the tank behind on the pavement and stunned officials wondering how the car still had enough fuel to move at all. The answer, of course, traced back to that oversized coiled fuel line still tucked inside the frame. Yunick himself later claimed the whole story was exaggerated folklore rather than a literal event, though plenty of people in the garage area swore they watched it happen with their own eyes. Fuel lines were not the only place Yunick hid extra capacity, and his next move involved a piece of sporting equipment nobody expected to find inside a stock car. Number 9. The basketball inside the fuel tank. This is the trick that most closely resembles outright cheating rather than clever rule reading. A rundown of NASCAR's classic tech inspection loopholes explains that Yunick would place an inflated basketball inside an oversized fuel tank before inspection, so that when officials filled the tank to check its capacity, the ball took up the extra space and made the tank appear legal-sized. Once the car passed inspection, the ball was deflated and pulled out, leaving a tank that could hold significantly more fuel than the rules allowed for the actual race. Remarkably, nothing in the rulebook at the time explicitly banned this, since the language focused on tank capacity during inspection rather than what happened to the tank afterward. It became one of the most retold Yunick stories precisely because of how simple and almost comical the method was. Fuel storage was not his only obsession, since Yunick also figured out how to make the fuel itself work harder before it ever reached the tank. Number 8. Freezing the fuel to beat the clock. Gasoline, like most liquids, contracts when it gets cold and expands as it warms up. For a stretch of NASCAR's early history, there were no rules governing the temperature of fuel poured into a car before a race. A feature published around his 100th birthday explains that Yunick would chill his fuel until it was nearly frozen before it went into the tank. Since colder liquid is denser and a fixed volume of cold fuel actually contained more usable gasoline than the same volume at room temperature. As the race progressed and the fuel warmed inside the tank, it expanded, effectively giving his cars extra range without ever exceeding the tank size on paper. NASCAR eventually mandated a minimum fuel temperature specifically because of tactics like this, closing yet another gap that Yunick had found before anyone else even thought to look for it. While fuel tricks dealt with range, Yunick also had to satisfy strict minimum weight requirements, and that led to one of his cleverer disappearing acts. Number 7. The roll bar full of sand. Every stock car had to meet a minimum weight to pass inspection, and Yunick reportedly found a way to hit that number without actually racing at that weight. Accounts collected from people who worked around his garage describe how Yunick would pack the hollow roll bars of his race cars with wet beach sand, adding enough mass to satisfy inspectors during the pre-race check. Small plugs were fitted into the floor of the car, and overnight the sand would dry out, allowing Yunick to pop the plugs and let the sand pour out before the green flag dropped. The car raced several pounds lighter than its inspected weight, a difference that mattered enormously in a sport where fractions of a second separated winners from also-rans. It was quiet, invisible, and almost impossible to catch, unless someone happened to be standing underneath the car at exactly the right moment. Weight was one form of hidden advantage, But Yunick also chased something far less visible to the naked eye, and that was clean airflow over the roof of the car. Number 6. A roof spoiler, hidden in plain sight. Aerodynamics mattered just as much as horsepower, and Yunick understood that decades before wind tunnels became standard equipment in every NASCAR shop. Driver David Pearson, recalling his years around Yunick's shop, once described how Yunick installed a small spoiler along the rear window of the roof to keep air from getting underneath and lifting the car at speed. A detail Pearson said you could see if you looked closely enough, though most casual observers never noticed it at all. It was subtle by design, blending into the roofline so completely that casual observers assumed it was simply part of the car's factory shape. That tiny addition improved stability at high speed, giving Yunick's cars an edge in exactly the kind of detail most competitors were not even thinking about yet. Roofline tricks were about balance in the air, but Yunick had already experimented with balance in a very different sense years earlier at a completely different race. Number 5. The capsule car and its front-mounted fuel tank. Long before his Chevelles caused chaos at Daytona, Yunick built a strange-looking machine for the Indianapolis 500 called the Hurst Floor Shifter Special. The car placed the driver off-center to the left, which shifted the vehicle's balance in a way that suited oval racing, but it also meant the rear-mounted engine threw the car's weight distribution out of alignment. Since there were no regulations at the time limiting how much fuel an Indy car could carry, Yunick installed a massive fuel tank at the very front of the car, directly in front of the radiator, creating a third mass point that helped even out the car's balance as fuel burned off during the race. The car never found real success on track, and it struggled to translate its unusual layout into consistent lap times. But it did not take long before officials at the United States Auto Club introduced fuel capacity rules clearly written with cars like this one in mind. It stands today as one of the strangest-looking machines ever built for Indianapolis, proof that Yunick's mind for loopholes did not stop at stock car ovals. Long before Indianapolis, Yunick had already been quietly rewriting the rules of engine building itself, starting with a problem hiding inside badly cast exhaust manifolds. Number 4. Porting exhaust manifolds without a grinder. Early in his career, Yunick worked with Hudson race cars that came with exhaust manifolds cast rough and uneven straight from the factory, restricting airflow and costing horsepower. NASCAR rules explicitly banned porting the manifolds out by hand using a grinder, since that was considered an unfair modification to a stock part. Yunick noticed the rulebook said nothing about pumping an abrasive compound back and forth through the manifold. Instead, a slower but technically legal method that smoothed and widened the internal passages almost as effectively as a grinder would have. The result was better airflow and more usable power, all without technically touching the manifold with a tool the rules had named. It became an early example of the pattern that would define his entire career, finding the one sentence the rulebook forgot to write, then quietly exploiting it while everyone else stayed focused on the sentences that were already there. Engine work built his reputation early, but it was a wild-looking Camaro built for speed records that pushed his rule bending into an entirely different arena. Number 3. The acid-dipped speed record Camaro. In 1967, Yunick built a Chevrolet Camaro intended to break small block speed records at the Bonneville Salt Flats, and the car became one of his most extensively modified builds. Detailed accounts of the project describe how Yunick used thinner window glass to cut weight, cut into the subframe to raise the floor and lower the car's ride height, and tilted the entire front end forward to reduce aerodynamic drag at high speed. He also had the body panels dipped in acid, shaving away just enough material to reduce overall weight without visibly altering the car's shape to casual observers. None of it was technically illegal for the record attempt, yet the car barely resembled a genuine stock Camaro by the time Yunick finished with it. It stood as proof that his talent for bending rules extended well beyond NASCAR ovals and into any form of motorsport willing to hand him a rulebook, whether that meant a superspeedway in Florida or a dry lake bed in Utah. Not every trick involved building something new, since one of his boldest moves was simply exploiting NASCAR's own inspection process from the inside. Number 2. Borrowing NASCAR's own templates. By the late 1960s, NASCAR had introduced body templates specifically to stop the kind of shape-shifting Yunick had gotten away with on his earlier Chevelles. Accounts shared by people close to his shop describe how a former Yunick employee once recalled that Smokey simply asked NASCAR officials if he could borrow the very templates used to check his own car, under the guise of making sure everything lined up correctly before the race. Whether or not officials fully realized what that request enabled, having direct access to the measuring tools meant Yunick could fine-tune his car's body to sit exactly at the edge of legal, rather than guessing and risking rejection at the inspection line. It was a masterclass in working within a system rather than against it, using the very rules meant to stop him as a roadmap for how far he could still go. And it is exactly the kind of story that has kept his name alive in garage conversations decades after the templates themselves changed shape. Not everything Yunick built was designed to bend a rule, and one of his most lasting contributions actually came from trying to solve a real engineering problem. Number 1. The reverse flow engine that outlived every trick. Later in his career, Yunick turned his attention toward engine cooling, developing what became known as reverse flow cooling, a system that redirected coolant to reach the hottest parts of the cylinder heads first rather than last. A profile of his induction into the Specialty Equipment Market Association Hall of Fame credits him with developing reverse flow engine cooling, the extended tip spark plug, and variable ratio power steering, work that influenced engineering decisions at Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Ford long after his racing days had ended. He held at least 9 United States patents by the end of his life, covering everything from fuel vaporizing systems to combustion engine improvements, work that had nothing to do with fooling an inspector and everything to do with genuine mechanical progress. Some of that research, including his adiabatic engine concepts, aimed at squeezing far more efficiency out of ordinary gasoline than the industry believed possible at the time. It is a reminder that underneath all the folklore about basketballs and sand-filled roll bars, there was a real engineer whose ideas outlasted every controversy attached to his name. After 13 tricks spanning fuel, weight, aerodynamics, and engine design, the only thing left to ask is what all of it actually earned him in the history books. Smokey Yunick passed away in 2001, and by then his name had become inseparable from the idea that NASCAR's early rulebook was written almost entirely in reaction to him. He was inducted into the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in 1990, a recognition of both his engineering talent and his decades-long influence on how the sport polices itself today, and one that placed him alongside the very champions his cars helped carry to victory lane. Whether any single trick attributed to him actually happened exactly the way the stories describe matters less than what those stories represent. A mechanic who refused to accept that the rulebook was the final word on what a race car could become. Every template, every fuel line regulation, and every inspection procedure NASCAR added during his era exists at least partly because Smokey Yunick found the gap first. Crew chiefs who came decades after him still study his work, not to copy the specific tricks, but to absorb the mindset behind them. The idea that a rule book is only as strong as the imagination of the people trying to read past it. That legacy, more than any single trick, innovation, or controversial moment, is what made him the genius NASCAR could never quite catch and never quite forget. Long after his racing days ended, his influence continued shaping the sport, ensuring his name remained part of its history for generations. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.